Hello, everybody. Welcome to this introduction to Catullus and his Carmina. I think that you're really going to like this poetry because it is full of emotion, both good and bad. It is full of humor. It is full of imagery. It is full of wit. It is full of angst, and that is Catullus, I think, at his best, at least for us in our classroom. So I wanted to give you a bit of an introduction because I think you can read it without any kind of context, and I think you can enjoy it. But the context for me is super, super important. So we want to know just about his world and his life and the place that his poetry takes in that context here. So let's go ahead and get started. These are some images of him. We don't have a ton to go by. Now, he was only 30. We know this from Jerome, the writer Jerome, who got his information from Suetonius, but that he was 30. And people disagree about the dates. 84 to 54, kind of the commonly accepted dates, and that's, for our purposes, that's as good as any. Some people feel like he was born a few years earlier or a few years later, but it's about right. Um, he was born in Verona, and Verona is right up here. And actually, at the time of his birth, this was actually a part of Gaul, not of Italia. But it's important here, and I'm starting with this because Catullus really was an outsider to Rome. So we've learned all about these people like Augustus and Caesar and all of these other leading figures of the day. And they, for all intents and purposes, were Roman through and through. Catullus wasn't. He was an outsider. He was a provincial. And so he is kind of looking at things from the outside in. So it's kind of like, if someone is born in the Midwest and moves to New York, and they're, in a lot of instances, a fish out of water. They're trying to find their place in things. They're trying to sidestep social faux pas and foibles. And Catullus, he commits a lot of them, and we know that many people in the circle of Rome, which he is very much entrenched, we know that he ticks off a bunch of them. Another, I think, really important thing is that although he doesn't pursue the military career after this, he does serve in 57 through 56. So for a year, he does serve in Bithynia as a tribunus Laticlavius, and his dealings in Bithynia, I think, really do influence his poetry as well. But the biggest thing is that he is an outsider. He, however, is from a pretty wealthy and pretty well-known family. So he is called a transpadanus. Okay, so a family or a member of the family from across the Po River. And the Po River, if I can use my cursor here to trace it, is pretty much like you see Venice here. It pretty much just goes like this. And that was a big delineation. Now, the Rubicon, a lot of students know this was the Rubicon River, Caesar crossing the Rubicon. That was your terminus of Italia. But Po was another one of those termini, I suppose we should say, um, of territories. And so, just again, reinforcing the fact that he is an outsider. Other other instances I think that are important, or other things to say about that, is that this was a highly Hellenized area, Greek influence. There was a lot of mercantile traffic, a lot of merchants going back and forth, especially to the east. So again, when he was in Bithynia, he probably wasn't just executing his military duties, but he was probably wheeling and dealing and trying to secure merchant contracts and things. His family, the Valeri Catuli, they were equestrians, and then quickly rose through the ranks and gained more and more wealth. So by the time of the first century AD, and this is after Catullus has passed, but by the time of the Julio Claudians in that first century AD, they are essentially patricians. They have a ton of wealth, and they are mingling with the high society there. Um, just kind of evidence of the wealth that they did have in Catullus's time, that there's a massive palace apparently at Sirmio, which is like right there with Verona, that Catullus's grandfather, we think his grandfather, built. And then there was another home at Tivoli, which is marked by the X here, so you can see Rome, and Tivoli is right outside of Rome. Okay. So the context that Catullus is literally walking into, because he comes to Rome, we don't really know when. but he comes to Rome and tries to entrench himself into this Roman high society. Well, this is the Rome that he's coming into. Remember, his birth dates, I'll go back to this real quick, 84, and then he dies in 54. So you can imagine that somewhere in 70 or so, he's a teenager verging on manhood, and he comes to Rome. And so we're talking about, 70-ish. Well, this is a Rome that is recovering from a lot of turmoil. So there was a massive civil war between two military leaders, Gaius Marius and Lucius Sulla. Um, and Sulla ruled with an iron fist for about 2.5 years in Rome. He leaves Rome in 79 willingly, and has his cronies kind of established to carry out his orders. And then really the next thing there is that Gnaeus Pompey, who you might know as Pompey the Great, fills that power vacuum in Rome. Not Caesar yet, Pompey. Pompey was the man in the 70s BC. So he crushes the revolt of Spartacus, and that's a whole other thing about other people had really done the dirty work, and he swooped in at the end. But he defeated Spartacus in 71. In 70, he has a consulship with Crassus, and Crassus's name, I think, because he is a member of that first triumvirate. And through the wheelings and dealings of the 60s, Crassus, Pompey, and Caesar consolidate their power in what we retrospectively call the first triumvirate, although they didn't call it that. So Pompey is the man in the 70s, and then he attaches himself to Caesar, who is coming up, Crassus, who is the money man. He's got more money than God in Rome, and they form that triumvirate, and that solidifies. Their partner is fully solidified in 60, and then that really sets the stage for Caesar to take control. So 59. So we're getting right to the time around Catullus and a lot of his poetry that we're going to read, his relationship with Clodia / who he calls Lesbia. Caesar leaves Rome to be the governor of Gaul. And when you're an AP, hopefully you take AP, you know that Caesar is governor of Gaul for almost 10 years, supposed to be for 10 years, but then he doesn't get what he wants, and in 49 he marches on Rome. But back in Rome, after Caesar leaves, it's back to Pompey to kind of keep the peace in Rome, and it's a time of tribulation. It's very dangerous in the city, to be honest, and a big reason that city is dangerous is because we have some basically gang leaders, political gang leaders. One of them is a guy named Milo. Another one is a guy named Clodius. Clodius is an amazing figure in history. He is colorful. He is scandalous. He does what he wants. And in 58, he is a tribune. He exiles his mortal enemy Cicero. There's rioting that happens between Milo and Clodius in 57. Eventually, Clodius is killed on the Appian Way in 52 BC in a big skirmish. Catullus is in Bithynia at this time. And Cicero actually gives or tries to give a speech in defense of Milo in 52, and it kind of goes off the rails. But we have that speech too. And speaking of Cicero and speeches in 56, and this really is where Catullus gets wrapped in, Cicero defends a guy named Marcus Caelius Rufus, and on a charge of murder and a couple other things. And Caelius is very guilty, and all the evidence is pointing to his guilt. And Cicero, in his speech, basically goes on a character assassination of one of the leading, or maybe the lead witness for the prosecution, a very fascinating woman named Clodia. And so we will talk about Clodia Pulchra, who is the Clodius's, Publius Clodius Pulcher. That's her brother. So this is Rome. I don't like this picture, but we don't have a ton of other really wonderfully reproduced images of Rome in the late Republican period. You definitely know that this is not a late Republican period picture because you see the Colosseum, and that wasn't built until, or at least finished until 79 AD, so like almost 100 years later. But you do have a lot of the structures that were there. You just see more of maybe a monumentalization of those things. But I'll point out here that we have the Palatine Hill, right here where I'm circling, and that can always be identified because you have the Circus Maximus in the valley behind it. And then it is hard to see, but this kind of promontory here is the apex of the Capitoline Hill. And Catullus is, when he comes to Rome, he is right in the midst of all of this stuff. Now, coming over here, this is a more Republican looking forum. So you can see, maybe even in comparing the two pictures, this isn't quite as monumentalized as this picture taken in the 2nd century AD, so 200 years later. This Roman forum, if I can maybe point out a couple things, if I could take this picture and sort of turn it diagonal, the Roman forum in this picture is here. So the picture you're seeing on the right is kind of what I'm circumscribing with my cursor right here. Okay, so very busy place, a very dangerous place, a lot of things going on. People that people like Caesar. There's Caesar on the left. Here's a pretty typical iconography of Caesar statuary, and then here is a reproduction of what we think he looked like based on that iconography. A pretty typical icon, a pretty typical bit of statuary for Pompey, although I'm sure that's a reproduction given the quality and the color of it. And then we have what an artist rendering would be of what maybe he actually looked like. And then we have Clodius, who is hard to track down in terms of images. This is pretty much the main image that we get of him. He kind of looks like Cicero. Some people say he kind of looks like Donald Trump. But this here is an artist interpretation, which maybe the nose is pretty right on, but there's a lot maybe that is different about these two images. But here are some pictures to go with some of these main characters that we know about in this period of Roman history. So Catullus, after coming to Rome, like I said, he does leave for just a year to go to Bithynia and be on the staff of a guy named Gaius Memmius. Now, they apparently have a falling out because he writes some poetry that's not very complimentary of Memmius. But Memmius was a patron of arts, and so I'm sure that Catullus's poetry and his abilities were cultivated by Memmius, and that might be part of why he's on his staff there. And we think that happened about 57, 56. We also know from, again, one of his poems, or a couple of his poems, that he had a brother who died while he was just on a visit near ancient Troy. And Catullus goes to mourn him at some point and writes a poem about it. We know that at some point he really ticked off Caesar with a bit of poetry, which, I mean, Caesar needs to get in line because he does that to everybody. But that apparently they met privately. Catullus apologized, and then it was water under the bridge. The last datable event that we have to his poetry, we are almost sure is 54, which is why we set his death date there. And then we work backwards because I think it was, again, by Jerome and Suetonius that he was 30 years old. So we work back to 84. So that's not a lot to know about his life. We just don't know a ton. We know more about the kind of artist that he was. Now, again, he is an outsider. He is coming into Rome, and the Rome that he is coming into, literarily, that's, if I can say that, loved these long, epic poems, Naevius and history poems about the Carthaginian Wars, about the Punic Wars, about the founding of Rome, about mythological stories, about Roman history, all of these kinds of things. Well, Catullus comes in having no interest in that. He's got his background from the Greek poets. Remember that really Hellenized area we talked about in northern Italy, there in Verona, as a transpadanus? Well, he wants to write things and he wants to compose things in the vein of Callimachus, in the vein of Sappho, these Greek poets and poetesses who had no interest in these long, drawn-out narratives, but about emotions, short epigrams, hymns, celebrating emotions, celebrating gods and goddesses of different emotions, those kinds of things, but also invectives, right? We just talked about how he had to kind of beg for Caesar's forgiveness because he ticked him off in a poem. So personal things and his feelings, well, my goodness, I mean, nothing is more different. Now, to some rungs of society, they might have been attracted to that shiny new thing from the outside. Catullus, Cinna, Calvus, all of these neoterics, which is what a term that is coined to describe these new poets. Cicero calls them the novi poetae, the new poets. But you can imagine Cicero being one of them. You know, the old stalwarts thought this was just terrible. Like, why would you go against convention and the good old days and very kind of conservative views on what is good literature? And so Catullus was pretty polarizing. He had a lot of people that loved him, he had a lot of people that hated him. And that, my friends, is a great segue to Clodia Pulchra. Speaking of love and hate. Okay, well, one of the things that Catullus talks about in his 116 Carmina, which this is debatable, but some people, some authorities, Wiseman, T.P. Wiseman, for instance, feels that Catullus did create his entire collection of Carmina, did curate it, pretty much what we have today. 26 of those 116 poems are about this woman. Now, these are not historically accurate pictures. They're inspired by Catullus's poetry, but I went ahead and put them on there because, you know, we need a face to the name, but we don't have the face to give it. So these are as good as any. And in fact, that middle one there, she's looking at a bird. And the first glimpse that we get of Clodia, whom Catullus calls Lesbia, is her relationship with this pet bird, and the bird really is a stand-in for love itself. So here is Clodia Pulchra, and Clodia. Who is Clodia? Well, let's talk about Clodia. Who is this woman that Catullus gets infatuated with, writes 26 Carmina about, and you can trace the beginning, the middle, and then the just awful end, the gut-wrenching end of their torrid love affair, which probably in reality lasted, 2 weeks, and honestly might have been more of a love affair for Catullus than for Clodia. If we had Clodia's viewpoint, it's highly possible she would have been like, Catullus? Oh yeah, okay, I remember him. But I digress. Okay, so who is this Clodia? All right. Well, she is from one of the oldest families in Rome. She's one of three daughters, one of six children in total, from Appius Claudius Pulcher. He was consul in 79 BC. His father was consul, I think, in 142, 143 BC. Very famous family, very entrenched patrician family. I'm circling her main residence there. So again, Palatine Hill, where the imperial palace ends up being. The Roman Forum is kind of here. The Capitoline Hill, Capitoline Hill, the Temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus is kind of right here. Well, she was right in the Beverly Hills of Rome, everybody, right there behind the Capitoline. She owned a Palatine residence near the Temple of Apollo, kind of, this way. Her brother owned two others. He tried to turn one of them into a palace and got into some problems with some real estate legislation. But she also lived right near Cicero. And all of that to say she was right in the mix. Her husband was another very famous person in Roman history, or of a famous family, of the Metelli family. His name was Quintus Caecilius Metellus Celer. Celer means swift. He was a consul in 60. He dies in 59. And because she was still married to him, Catullus gives the convention of a pseudonym. So he calls her Lesbia. And we'll talk about that pseudonym later, what Lesbia means, why he might have chosen that. We do know that their marriage, Clodia and Metellus Celer, it was not a happy marriage. He was gone a lot. They didn't seem to get along. They apparently had a daughter. And she apparently cheated on him prolifically, had no qualms about extramarital affairs. After her husband's death, and I think this is important, so he died in 59. Remember, Catullus dies in 54. So from 59 to 54 is this period that I think we're concerned with. She passes into the manus, so the control. Remember, women don't really have rights on their own, right? So they're under the control of their father. And if the father's dead, as her father was, the brothers. And of course, if the woman is married, she's in the control of the husband. to certain degrees that can be drawn up through contract. Well, when the husband dies, she passes back into the control, the manus, of her brothers. And from what we can tell, her brothers could have cared less what she did with all of the money that she had. So she had just free reign, really highly unusual for a woman in Rome to really just completely act independently. But she did. And she, again, was quite a figure. A little kind of coda here that after Catullus, after the love affair with Catullus, she then has an affair apparently with a guy named Marcus Caelius. Now I say a guy named Marcus Caelius, but you might remember that name because he is the one that is put on trial for murder by uh, uh, and defended by Cicero. And apparently that relationship did not end well. There was a lot of enmity there, and that is one of the motivating factors to the character assassination that Cicero puts on her. That was apparently so effective that we hear nothing about her afterwards. So there's the trial of Caelius. Cicero's speech is in 56. Caelius is put up on 4 charges. One of them essentially is a murder charge, and he is incredibly guilty. This trial fascinated Rome at the time. Now, it didn't go on for very long. It was just a matter of days, but it was during the Megalentia, this big festival, and it was really a spectacle that all the you know who's of Rome were there to watch. And on I think it was the last day of the trial, Cicero defends his client, knowing pretty much that his client is completely guilty, completely implicit of this murder of an Egyptian ambassador, an Alexandrian ambassador named Dio. And he knows that Clodia witnessed some wheelings and dealings with bribing and obtaining some poison and these kinds of things. And so he just goes on a character assassination, and he calls her the Medea of the Palatine. And if you know your mythology, you know kind of what that entails. Medea is associated with conniving, with poisoning, and also being a strong woman. And Clodia certainly was. And he also calls her Clodia Quadrata. Clodia, you can have for a quadrans. And everybody, to put it gently, quadrans is a penny. And so he's saying, you could pay for Clodia's relationship for a penny. So he essentially calls her a prostitute. And so this apparently worked because Caelius was acquitted. And incidentally, he has to come back the very next day because he's a senator. He would have been exiled if he were guilty, but he has to come back the next day and decide among a dispute between Cicero and somebody else. Really interesting wheelings and dealings there in the politics at the time. Clodia herself, we hear nothing more about her after this trial, except that Cicero's buddy Atticus writes a letter to Cicero and says, "Hey, I tried to get her to sell me her home near the Tiber River, and she refused to do it." Well, that's the only thing we hear about her. That's pretty significant, everybody. I mean, in and of itself, but also because in 52 BC, remember, I said earlier, her brother was murdered. Publius Clodius. Clodius was murdered on the Appian Way in basically a gang war outside of Rome. And we don't hear anything about her mourning his death, being present at a funeral, nothing like that. We hear nothing. So we guess that she just left town and said, "You know what? I'm out of this place. I don't need this," and went to her estate at Baiae or any of these other places that she owned because she was insanely wealthy. Now, again, Catullus' love affair with Lesbia, remember his pseudonym for Clodia. We don't have a specific date, but at least Wiseman and a couple others dated around 60. She was married, so we know it couldn't have been 59 or beyond, right? Because her husband was dead at that point. And in the introduction to the textbook that I use in my classes, I like this quote that the relationship, the affair, was probably more literary fiction than literary autobiography, like a kernel of truth. But Catullus is a writer, he is a poet, and his job is to entertain. And so, he's surely taking liberties with her and himself. It's not corroborated by any other sources. We just don't know anything about it other than what Catullus tells us. And boy, I wish we could get an account of it from Clodia. So I alluded to this before, but the pseudonym that he uses for her is an ode to Sappho. Incidentally, pseudonyms, kind of fun fact, poets, when they use pseudonyms, typically they are three syllables. But Lesbia here is an ode to Sappho, who is a poetess from the island of Lesbos, a Greek poet. And we see some other homages to Sappho in his poetry. Carmen 11 is written in Sapphics, and then Carmen 51 is essentially just a translation of a Sappho poem. I said earlier, 26 of the 116 poems, Carmina, that we have are about Lesbia, but their affair was pretty brief, although definitely inspired some great poetry. Imagine if you had a relationship and it was a flash in the pan relationship, everybody, and it lasted a week or two, and people were still talking about it 2,000 years later. I think this is one of the reasons I love reading Catullus. Now, I hate to end on a bad note, but I have to say this. We've talked a lot about Clodia Pulchra. We've talked a lot about the sister of Clodius, and the person whose character was assassinated by Cicero in this trial. If we are being completely honest and historically accurate, Catullus's Clodia was probably not Catullus's Lesbia was probably not that Clodia, but it was probably one of her sisters. I know, but I do have to say it's really fun to think about that it is Illa Clodia, that is that Clodia, because she was just so amazing, such an amazing woman. And when you peel back the layers of a lot of male dominated scholarship, male dominated life, male dominated environment, and you kind of you remove that screen, what you end up with is a really incredibly remarkable woman who was highly independent, highly intelligent, highly in control of her own destiny in a world where women were none of those things, or considered it. The environment did not consider it to be okay for a woman to be any of those things. Not highly educated, not in control of her own finances and her own social wheelings and dealings, all of that stuff. She was remarkable. So I think there's a willful suspension of disbelief, at least willful on my part, to pretend that maybe, just maybe, it is the Clodia. So this is your introduction to Catullus and his poetry. Now, again, many other poems not about Clodia, but we will read almost all 26 of them. And the other ones really are wonderful in and of themselves. But this is the life and times of Catullus, and I hope you enjoyed it.